Thank you for watching. This second video is about the Book of Abraham, Facsimile 2, and how it was translated.
So Abraham says he went back to the Garden of Eden to delineate the diversity of the two trees in the garden. I shall endeavor to delineate the chronology running back from myself to the beginning of creation. The record of Adam has come into my hands, Abraham 1:28.
We demonstrate how we connect the perfectly numbered Egyptian hieroglyphs to Joseph Smith's biblical translation by matching the numbers to the verses in the Bible. In the first book of Genesis, we see the same numbers perfectly match up to the verses.
This also matches the same Bible verses as chapter 4 of Abraham, where extra biblical information is being added. Considering where was God when he created the earth, the Bible does not answer that question. Or who was God talking to when he said, "Let us make man in our image"? So let's honestly look at Joseph Smith's translation of Facsimile 2. So Joseph Smith labels this God with two faces towards the past and future as number one. So Dr. Mercer, a PhD Egyptologist, said this was the god Khnummu, the oldest god in ancient Egypt. He was considered the first creator by uniting himself with Osiris within the first creation, the father of creation. So what exactly is Joseph Smith doing when he cross-references figure 1 here with figure 1 over here? For obviously Joseph Smith's translation did not match with what the Egyptologists just told us. Joseph Smith translates this as the star Kolob, nearest to the God of creation, the heart. The residence of God himself, first in government pertaining to the measurement of time, the location where God counts one day. So even though these translations are quite different, they both seem to be pointing to Genesis 1, the story of God's creation. Then we have creator number 2, who looks exactly like the first creator. But then the Egyptologist tells us that number 2 represents a ram with two faces, a God facing both directions, future and past, facing toward the rising sun and the setting. For the Egyptian sun god symbolized life, death, and resurrection. The sun died during the night and was reborn the next morning. The godly figure is obviously connected to this sacrificial altar. So it shows that the Egyptians believed in a creator, a God who created animals. He was represented by an altar. But was he not a counterfeit of the true God of the Bible? Therefore, wouldn't we expect Joseph Smith's translation to be different than the Egyptologist? For he's translating that which is false, a counterfeit, back into the true Father in heaven of the Bible, or the Creator back into the true Creator of heaven and earth, Jesus Christ. Therefore, the Father and Son, who created the heaven and the earth in chapter 1 of Genesis, would not match up with the translation of the Egyptologist, but it would match up with the translation of Joseph Smith. So what about translating number 3 here, a god on a boat? So the Egyptologists translate a cartoon character who doesn't even exist. A boat rowing across the sky representing the sun god Horus, illuminating the world. A god who never existed, never was, and never will be. Horus having dominion over all things, giving his light to the world. So we have an Egyptian god with a sun disk over his head, giving light to the world. An altar on his boat. What does the prophet tell us that figure 3 should mean here, over here? The scriptures tell us God is light. God sitting upon his throne, clothed with the light of eternal glory upon his head. That same power to be given to the prophets. God's light was symbolic of the sun in the sky, as Christ giving light to the world. So here's something I don't think anybody noticed. The verses in the Bible, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, match perfectly with the Egyptian counterfeits here. It's like they took these things right out of the Bible and counterfeited them. Therefore, in verse 3, God says, "Let there be light." So we take this up here, and it matches perfectly with a counterfeit of the Egyptian God who's giving light. Therefore, Jesus Christ is the true God who gives light, the light and life of the world. Therefore, the Egyptians have translated this wrong and counterfeited it. So the numbers of these Bible verses in the book of Genesis match exactly with the book of Abraham here, which are numbered against this, which are exactly matching with this. So once again, let's take verse 4 here in Genesis 1 and match it up with figure 4 here in the facsimile and see if we're talking about the same kind of thing. We have a bird figure in a boat crossing the sky. Once again, the PhD translates this.
The outstretched wings of the hawk indicate the realm of the afterlife following death, or the measurement of time between birth and death. Life depicting light and death depicting darkness seems to demonstrate the duality of all things, such as day versus night, bad versus good, temporal life expanding into eternal life.
So how did Joseph Smith translate this over here?
Joseph describes this figure as representing the expanse of the firmament, the sun, spanning heaven, pertaining to the numerical count of measuring time. And of course, verse 4 in the Bible is about God dividing the darkness from the light. Number 4 depicted as figure 4 here. So why this emphasis on the sun, moon, and stars in the creation? God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons." Was it not the original means by which Enoch's calendar expanded into 12 months each year? So obviously the Egyptians tried to reinvent their own symbolism regarding chapter 1 of Genesis verse 4, in which Joseph Smith tells us this represents the expansion of time in the firmament. Egyptologists also confirm that this bird figure represents Horus the hawk, who was reborn and resurrected. Of course, in Ezekiel's wheel, this bird figure was depicted as an eagle. So now when we go to verse 5, everything shifts away from the context of chapter 1 here. And matching the Bible, the book of Abraham also shifts on figure 5 to a new context. So in order to shift from number 4 to number 5, we have to turn this facsimile upside down. And we see that figure 5 is the figure of a bull. So the figure of a bull doesn't really symbolize anything true in the Egyptian religion. It's just mythology. But in the Bible, the young bull, who is an offspring from his mother, means something very important. For the Bible describes Joseph as the young bull. His 2 horns are the horns of his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So in the Egyptian religion, we see a female figure standing here holding a branch of fertility over the back of this bull. What do the Egyptologists say about these figures? This figure represents the bull in the sky, leading around the celestial center. The female Uzat goddess is holding a sacred branch of a tree over the bull's body. Dr. Mercer places this into a funerary context as welcoming the deceased. So once again, the pagans and the Egyptologists are going to translate this into mythology. But Joseph Smith is going to translate it back into a biblical context. So am I just assuming things here, or does figure number 5, which matches a bull which represents Joseph, translate into a biblical understanding with the number 5? If it does, then I know we're on the right track. Let's check. So Joseph Smith's clue is number 5. Is there a highly significant verse which starts out with verse 5 pertaining to Joseph? Absolutely, and it just happens to be the opening verse to Joseph's famous dream. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told his brethren, and they hated him even more for it. Genesis 37, verse 5. Yes, Joseph's dream, associating the sun, moon, and stars with the heavenly bodies above during the creation period of Genesis 1, transitioning perfectly to the next step. So now we go to Joseph Smith's translation in the book of Abraham, and we go to figure 5 here. And if it's not talking about heavenly bodies of the dream pertaining to this subject matter, then we know we're barking up the wrong tree. For Joseph Smith's translation of number 5 either translates into the heavenly bodies of the dream, or the whole thing fails. So if this one's right, I think we've moved beyond coincidence. Joseph says in number 5, it's an image in the sky representing one of the governing planets, holding the grand key for borrowing light from God's throne. The Egyptians say it is the sun. Joseph Smith says it's a higher source of light called the grand key, or the priesthood, which Joseph, as the birthright son, would hold, holding the higher power which governs 15 other heavenly bodies and stars. So when Joseph had his dream, he was very young, but he still saw that his authority and birthright would be over the sun, moon, and stars, his father the sun, his mother the moon, and his 11 brothers. So at that time, his number over Israel is 13. So did Joseph Smith make a big mistake? For he says he governs 15 here, not 13. So later on we see that Joseph has 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So we add 2 more to Israel, and they become Israel.
making 15 instead of 13. So Joseph Smith never was translating this into Egyptian mythology like the anti-Mormons want to make you believe. He's translating this back into the book of Genesis. So at this point, it becomes astronomically impossible to explain why Joseph Smith translated number 5 here into these 15 heavenly bodies, which could only represent Joseph of Israel in the book of Genesis. And now the coincidences become even more impossible to explain. For number 5 represents the bull, who can only represent Joseph of the Old Testament, symbolically. So evidently Joseph Smith is not done giving us evidence pertaining to number 5 here. There's secondary evidence down here at the bottom, where he tells us to go to these Bible verses 22 and 23 to find additional information about these 15 heavenly bodies. So combining these clues and codes of verses 22 and 23, we turn to chapter 49. And sure enough, verse 22 starts out with Joseph being a fruitful bough, or a tree, his family tree. We're talking about his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 stars that add up to 15, as they run over this wall of water. In other words, 2 branches from the family tree of Joseph, who run over the wall of water, the deep, to reach the land of America, the promised land of Joseph. He also includes verse 23. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. Verse 23 links back to Joseph's dream, which is verse 5, where his brothers hated him. And of course the bull here is matched in Ezekiel's wheel, whereby we see the bull once again representing one of the 4 living creatures, representing heaven and earth in the temple. It certainly seems that these 4 living creatures shown here are being counterfeited over here by the Egyptians, whereby we see this female figure holding a branch of fertility over this bull. And then we see 4 living creatures, number 6, who represent the outer circle of the bull again. Here we see the bull representing what Joseph Smith says are 4 corners of the sphere. And unlike what anti-Mormons think, Joseph Smith did not translate these 4 living creatures into 4 Egyptian gods. He translated it over here into something quite different. He said these 4 figures represent the earth in its 4 quarters, nothing else. For God tells Moses in Deuteronomy 33 that Joseph is the bull, and the 2 horns shall push the people of God together to the ends of the earth. In other words, the 4 corners of the earth. We're talking about the sons of Joseph, not the sons of Horus. So in Scripture, we know the stars in heaven represent metaphorically God's sons upon the earth. So here's where this equation finally comes together. We have this hieroglyph here with number 1, this God, who is pointing to these 2 figures on his right and on his left here. And look, they have sun discs over their head, which means they are sons of God. And they are numbered 22 and 23, the same numbers that Joseph Smith indicated and points to regarding the sons of Joseph. And we see in verse 22 and 23, these branches run over this body of water. And sure enough, we see this branch running over this container of water, pointing to Son 23. But then we unmistakably see a second branch here coming over the right shoulder of God, pointing to Son 22. But even though some of the original teachings and figures are here, the Egyptians turned this all into a myth. Therefore, God had to give Joseph Smith a revelation to translate this in reverse back to its original Bible teaching. So this is obviously not about stars in the night sky giving light to each other as the critics talk about. This is about God giving his priesthood light to the sons of Joseph, the birthright tribe, for the last days. He faces the future and the past. The dispensation of the fullness of times is brought together by the authority given to these 2 sons of Joseph. So if it's the book of Abraham or the Bible, if you take Joseph out of the equation, none of the loose ends of biblical understanding come together. Biblically speaking, only Joseph could represent the patriarchal throne of both God and Abraham, whereby the branch of the birthright would spread the gospel to the 4 corners of the earth and gathering Israel in the latter days. We are just getting started with this huge discovery that no eyes have yet seen. We will continue this encrypted translation, which will demonstrate exactly how Joseph Smith translated the hieroglyphs, which will open up the greatest mystery on earth in Daniel and the book of Revelation. Thanks for watching.